In this video, I'll be offering you my review of the TTArtisan 35mm f1.8 Mark II autofocus lens for APS-C systems and comparing it to the Mark I version. Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. In this video I'll be giving you my thoughts on the new TTArtisan 35mm f1.8 Mark II for APS-C systems. Now of course I'll be using the Fujifilm X mount version here because those are the cameras that I use, but everything that's in this review except perhaps the exact autofocus performance will apply to all mounts of this lens. Now it hasn't been all that long since TTArtisan released the original version of this lens and we're already seeing an updated Mark II version, which I guess suggests that the company feels their technology has come far enough to warrant updating the lens. Now, while I would have rather to see a new focal length from them, something like maybe a 16mm or an 18mm, this is what they have chosen to do, so we'll take a close look at it here and see how it compares to the old version. Now, as always, TTArtisan did send this lens over for testing, and the only thing that they have requested of me was to get a timely review out on this channel. I do get to keep the lens and no money has changed hands, so all thoughts here are my own and have come from using this lens in the very, very cold weather that we've had here for the past few weeks or so. So let's get started and see how it compares. Now looking at the lens, you'd be forgiven for thinking it was exactly the same lens if you didn't see them side by side. Now the lettering is the same, the design language is the same, and there's nothing to really tell them apart except that the Mark II version is slightly shorter and has a different minimum focus distance etched on the front of the lens. That reduction in minimum focus distance and also the smaller size of the new lens has been afforded by a changed optical formula that has also somewhat changed the characteristics of the images, as we'll see in the next section. Now, the materials feel like the same good quality metals that we've seen in other lenses in this series. The focus ring feels a little bit tighter on this new lens, and of course we're still missing an aperture ring. Now, as I said in my TTArtisan 23mm review, I really feel like adding an aperture ring is the way that TTArtisan could differentiate this series from the other budget offerings at this end of the market. But back to size and weight though. Now, the lens is a quoted 16mm shorter in length than the Mark I lens, which doesn't magically make it a tiny XF35mm f2, but it's definitely an appreciable reduction. Now, the same goes for the weight. It's 23 grams, or about 12% or so lighter, and it's definitely noticeable on small bodies like the XT50. Now, TTArtisan also includes the new style of hood that they've included with the 23mm f1.8 lens, and in fact, as far as I can tell, it's exactly the same hood. Now, while I do generally like a petal hood for the ability to access filters from the front of the lens and also to be able to reverse it for storage, this one is quite bulky compared to the lens and it doesn't really extend far enough forward to block any stray light or protect the lens from knocks. And I actually did come to like the square hoods from the original lenses because they were quite compact and very good at protecting the lens from knocks or a little bit of light rain. Now, unfortunately, the clip design on those old hoods means that they're not compatible with the new lenses. So even though I still have them, I couldn't make use of them while testing this lens. So this guy ended up just staying at home a lot. TTArtisan is still including their firmware update rear lens cap, which I really love, but I wish that they would refine the design of it a little bit so that it would fit well on other lenses. That way, for example, I could switch to something like my XF23mm, my Fujifilm lens, and know that I could put this in my bag safely without having to worry that it will fall off and perhaps risk scratching my much, much more expensive XF lenses. Autofocus with this lens feels a lot like it did with the original lens, which is to say that it's quite good for a stepping motor, but it's not nearly as snappy as something like the linear motors in Fujifilm's best XF lenses. But it does seem to have had a couple of tweaks though, and it feels a little bit quicker, and I haven't seen any missed focus, which is something that I did notice with the Mark I version of the lens. Single autofocus feels slightly slower than the best stepping motors that I've tested, but still slightly faster than Fujifilm's XF35mm f2 from memory. However, one annoying point is that the lens seems to forget where it was focused when you switch the camera off. So when you turn the camera back on, you're always starting from the minimum focus distance. Now, this wasn't an issue with the first lens, and in fact, it's actually the first time that I've seen this with any of their lenses, so I do hope that it's an easy firmware fix. Now, tracking also works really well with this lens, and I've had an excellent hit rate with people walking and cycling as I've been testing the lens, so overall it does a great job, and it's not the sort of focal length that you're going to be, say, tracking birds in flight with anyway, so autofocus is perfectly adequate and fit for purpose, I would say. Compared with the Mark I version of this lens, the center of the frame is quite a bit sharper wide open and stays slightly sharper at every aperture value as the lens is stopped down. By f2.8 it's very good, and there are only minor differences as the lens is stopped down beyond that point. That's a really big improvement over the Mark I lens. On the other hand, the corners seem to be a little softer than the Mark I lens, which didn't show a lot of difference between the center and the corners of the frame. But thankfully, the corners are nowhere near as soft as the TTArtisan 33mm lens that I tested in my last video. They do get better as the lens is stopped down though, and they're about equal to the performance of the Mark I lens by f5.6, so if you're looking for corner-to-corner detail, definitely stop the lens down significantly for the best results. One thing that I did notice while doing this direct comparison of the lenses was that the Mark II lens has a slightly wider field of view than the old lens. Now, it's not a huge difference, and it's not something that you're going to want to upgrade to the lens just to get a little bit more in the frame for, but it is a change nonetheless. Chromatic aberration is slightly improved by the new formula as well, but it's still not great. We still see significant fringing around the out of focus areas, but it's not as pronounced as the Mark I lens was. Stopping down past f4 helps quite a bit with this as well. Coma and astigmatism are other areas where the Mark II version of this lens has improved quite a bit. Now, again, they're still not great by any means, but they are improved over the previous version. As the lens is stopped down to f4, they clean up completely and pin lights are rendered as they should be. The first thing I want to talk about with creative image quality is not specifically related to image quality, but it does open up new possibilities. Now, the Mark II version of this lens can focus significantly closer than the Mark I lens could. It now focuses down to 40 centimeters instead of 60 centimeters, allowing you to really get in close, and obviously the reduction in minimum focus distance allows the lens to create larger bokeh balls from pin lights or specular highlights when focused in closer. The new lens design does a nicer job of rendering these anyway, thanks to its slightly reduced CA. Also, the bokeh now takes on a more significant cat's eye shape towards the corners of the frame, and we see a bit more of that swirl to it in everyday photography. In more common use, like this frame of my coffee, I really like the way that it renders the smooth transition out to the background. I don't see anything here that bothers me at all, and I would be happy to make use of this bokeh for simple scenes like this. In more complex scenes, it also has a significantly nicer rendering than the Mark I lens, in my opinion. The softer edges we saw in the bokeh balls and the slightly reduced chromatic aberration come together for a less jittery rendering when used at the same focus distance. However, the Mark II lens really does begin to shine when you're getting close to the minimum focus distance. There it can produce some really nice smooth bokeh with a bit of a swirl to it. Overall, I'd consider the bokeh produced by this new lens to be more pleasing to my eye. Sunstars begin to form at f2.8, and by f4 they're reasonably well defined, but they don't take over the frame. They can also be used with the sun itself, but it does pay to be extra careful, as small movements can introduce some fairly extreme flare and ghosting. Flare can be quite an issue with this lens. While it's good at certain angles, small movements can quickly introduce a complete loss of contrast. Now, when the sun is in the frame, that flare can get quite extreme. But if you're careful when you have lights around the edges of the frame, a dance can be done to create a similar forked pattern to what we saw with the 23mm f1.8 lens from TTArtisan. Overall though, if you're careful, this lens can deliver clean images, and flare and ghosting can be used creatively when you want them, but it definitely pays to keep an eye on them when you have the sun in or near the frame, because things can quickly change. The vignette produced by this lens is around 2 stops when used wide open, and it improves to around 1 stop by f2.8 and f4. At f8 it's around a half stop, but it doesn't completely go away. When used wide open, I found that it can be a little difficult to correct for the vignette in the far corners of the frame, and it's just something you'll have to live with or spend quite a bit of time working on in post-production. Now, it's winter here right now, and while I've had this lens, the weather has been on the wrong side of freezing each and every day, so my walks with the lens have been necessarily short. But even on the days when it's been -10 or lower, this lens has held up well, and I haven't had any issues at all with it, except for my fingers not really being able to turn the dials on the camera after a while. A physical aperture ring would really have helped with that, and I really miss that on this series of lenses. But onto what the lens is like to use though. Now, autofocus is not a night and day difference from the original lens, but it didn't fail at all during my photo walks, and I didn't see any out of focus images returned during my testing, which was really great to see. Now, in harsh backlight, the significant flare that the lens produces can trip up the autofocus system in Fujifilm cameras, which we know can struggle in the best of light anyway, but quickly changing the composition to remove the flare, and then using a focus to recompose technique helped a lot with getting images in focus in those cases. Now, the flare and ghosting are very different from the original lens, which produced these concentric circles with bright lights nearby. Now, this lens produces a much more usable and interesting set of sort of forked light rays, and as always, I found myself looking to work with that shortcoming. Now, at times the lens produces two sets of those in the frame, and you can actually use those to frame a subject, for example. The issue that I mentioned in the autofocus section of the lens always resetting itself to 0 when the camera is switched off is quite annoying when you're out working with the lens. This lens formula has some significant breathing that comes with it, and the frame can change quite a bit from minimum focus to a few meters away, meaning that you often need to recompose significantly after focusing. Now, focus breathing this significant can be annoying at the best of times, but when the lens focuses back to its minimum distance every time the camera is switched on and off, it just gets in the way of photography, which is something that I really don't want from any of my equipment. Now, aside from that, it's been a reliable lens that produces decent images. This is another good budget offering from TTArtisan. Now, it's definitely better than the Mark I version of the lens in a lot of ways, but I'm not sure that I would say upgrade to this lens if I'd already purchased the first one. It has marginal improvements in autofocus and also the sharpness in the center of the frame. It also sees some improvements in flare and ghosting, which have become a lot more usable in a creative way. However, if I were looking to upgrade my existing TTArtisan lens, I might want a little bit more than that. Now, something like the XF35mm f2 offers a weather-resistant build and a physical aperture ring, along with much better flare and ghosting resistance, for example. But if you don't already own a prime at this focal length, this could be a good place to start on a budget. Now, as far as I could find, this is the cheapest autofocus prime in this category, and it offers a lot of what the more expensive ones do. For a similar price, you might also be able to pick up, say, an XC 35mm f2, which has the same image quality as the XF version of that lens, but probably a worse build quality than this TTArtisan lens. There are also the Viltrox and Meiki lenses that I reviewed recently. The Viltrox is smaller and lighter and has slightly better correction for chromatic aberration, and the Meiki, of course, is a little bit bigger and heavier, but comes with an aperture ring and a weather seal at the mount. Now, I'll leave links to all of those reviews in the description below, and now that I finally have all of these similar focal length lenses in hand, I will be working on a comparison video similar to the one that I did with 56mm lenses last year, so do get subscribed for that. Now, I would say that this lens is a good choice if your budget doesn't stretch much further, and you'll be able to create some good images with it. Of course, it's the few kilos of squishy meat behind the camera that creates the images and not the lenses themselves, and this lens has no glaring flaws that are going to stop that process from happening. So I hope that you've enjoyed this review and got what you came for, but if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and enjoy the slideshow. I'll see you guys in the next video.